He broke into my shop to steal my father's silver cross and bled to death on my floor before I could call the police. That was how it began, the night the rain refused to stop falling. The city lights blurred behind the storm, smearing gold and red across the soaked glass of the antique store where Evelyn Crane worked alone. She'd stayed long past closing, pretending to tidy the shelves, but really she was avoiding the silence of her apartment and the memories that lived there like ghosts. The air smelled of varnish, candle wax, and the faint metallic tang of rain seeping through the old windows. The world outside was gray and endless, as though time itself had drowned. Evelyn adjusted the clock on the counter, a stubborn heirloom that chimed 2 minutes late, and reached for her coat. That was when she saw him. At first he looked like a trick of the light, a blur of motion between the street lamps, nothing more than another vagrant passing through the storm. But then she caught the glint of metal in his hand. A lockpick. He was at the door of the neighboring pawn shop, working the mechanism with a speed and precision that didn't belong to desperation. Her stomach tightened. Break-ins weren't rare in this part of town, but something about the man's movements, so fluid, almost elegant, made her hesitate. She should have turned off the lights and called the police. Instead, she found herself watching, caught between fear and a strange fascination. The thief jerked suddenly, his hand flying to his side. He staggered back from the door, pressing against the brick wall, leaving a dark smear where his fingers had been. Blood, or something thicker. His head lifted for an instant, and even through the rain and distance, she saw the impossible color of his eyes, crimson beneath the streetlight, gleaming like fresh spilled wine. Evelyn's breath hitched. He turned away, swaying as though drunk, and collapsed onto the sidewalk. Her mind screamed, "Don't go," but her body had already moved. Umbrella forgotten, she ran into the rain. The wind tore at her coat, plastering her hair to her face. The man lay half in shadow, water pooling beneath him. His skin was so pale, it looked carved from marble, his lips faintly blue. She crouched beside him, trying to see the wound. "Hey, can you hear me?" she called, shaking his shoulder. His eyes opened. Not human. Not sane. Burning with a fevered light. His hand shot up and caught her wrist. "Don't," he hissed, voice rough and low. "They'll smell you." "What are you talking about?" She tried to pull free, but his strength was shocking. The rain sluiced down his face, washing away a streak of black-red blood from his temple. He looked both young and ancient, a contradiction carved in flesh. "Hunters," he breathed. "They'll come for me." The word hung in the air, meaningless and terrifying. Evelyn looked up and saw, through the haze of rain, 3 figures at the far end of the street. Dark coats, silver weapons glinting faintly in their hands. She didn't think. She dragged the stranger's arm over her shoulder and hauled him upright. He was heavy, dead weight against her, yet moved with a strength that made no sense. She half dragged, half guided him across the alley and through her shop's door, kicking it shut behind them just as headlights swept past outside. Inside, the quiet was suffocating. The only sounds were the storm and the slow drip of water from their clothes. The stranger collapsed near the counter, his breath shallow, his hands shaking. Evelyn turned the lock and yanked the curtains closed, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. When she knelt beside him again, she saw the wound properly for the first time. A gash across his ribs, the flesh dark and glossy, not quite bleeding but seeping light like dying embers. "God," she whispered, "what did this to you?" He gave a hoarse laugh. God? Not him. Never him. She pressed a towel to his side, ignoring the heat that pulsed beneath her palm. "You need a hospital." "No," he said. eyes unfocused. No hospitals. No light. Just quiet. His gaze drifted toward the window as thunder cracked outside. They'll smell blood. Evelyn had no idea who they were, but the terror in his voice was real. She swallowed her questions and worked faster, cleaning the wound, wrapping it with trembling hands. The blood was cold against her skin, colder than ice water. When she looked up, his eyes were on her again, less wild now, almost curious. "Why are you helping me?" he asked softly. "Because you're bleeding on my floor," she said, forcing a wryness she didn't feel. "And because no one else would." He watched her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. "Foolish," he murmured. "Kind, but foolish." The word, kind, struck something deep inside her, something that had been quiet for a long time. She shrugged it off and fetched a blanket. When she returned, he was barely conscious, his head lolling to the side. She tucked the fabric around him and noticed the chain around his neck, a silver locket, blood-stained but exquisitely crafted. A strange sigil was etched into its surface, a rose wrapped around a crescent moon. Without thinking, she brushed her fingers against it. The metal burned her skin, but she didn't pull away. The stranger's eyes snapped open. "Don't touch that," he said, voice suddenly sharp. "It's sorry," she stammered. It's not meant for mortal hands," he whispered. "It remembers." "Remembers what?" He didn't answer. His eyes drifted shut again, and his breathing slowed until she thought he was gone. She sat beside him through the storm, the smell of wet iron filling the air, the clock ticking endlessly toward morning. She should have thrown him out. She should have been afraid. Instead, she found herself studying his face, wondering what kind of creature could bleed like that and still look so human. When dawn crept gray across the window, she was still awake. The stranger hadn't moved, but the locket at his throat glowed faintly, casting patterns across the shelves of broken mirrors and forgotten clocks. Evelyn didn't yet know his name, or that the men in the street were still searching for him. She didn't know that she'd just crossed into a world where kindness could kill and mercy could rewrite history. She only knew one thing, that when he had looked at her, for a single heartbeat, he had looked alive. When Evelyn woke, the first thing she noticed was silence, the kind that hums beneath the skin, heavy and waiting. Morning light filtered through the curtains, pale as bone, drawing faint gold lines across the antique shop's wooden floor. For a moment she almost believed the night had been a fever dream, a half-mad vision conjured by loneliness and exhaustion. But then she saw him. The stranger, the thief, the bleeding ghost she had dragged in from the rain, lay where she had left him. He was still, too still, and yet the air around him carried a strange pull, as though the room itself bent subtly toward his presence. The locket at his throat gleamed faintly, catching the first light of dawn and scattering it in fractured silver. Evelyn crouched beside him, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. There was no pulse, no warmth, only that same cold stillness. And yet when she brushed his cheek, the skin felt supple, alive. His wound was closed, not healed exactly, but sealed by a blackened scar that looked like dried ink instead of blood. Her breath caught as she leaned closer. No human body could repair itself in a few hours, not after losing so much blood. Before she could retreat, his eyes opened. They were no longer gray or crimson, but a deep, storm-dark violet that reflected her own startled face. He didn't move, only watched her, as if waiting to see what she would do next. "You're awake," she said, keeping her voice steady. He blinked slowly, the motion almost feline. "You shouldn't have stayed," he murmured. His voice was low but smoother than before, carrying a trace of an old, almost aristocratic accent. "If they find you, they'll think you helped me." "Who exactly are they?" she asked. "And who are you?" He shifted, wincing as he sat up. The motion should have reopened the wound, but it didn't. "Dorian," he said finally. "That name will do." "Will do?" she echoed. "Like it's one of many?" His lips curved faintly. "Names change. People don't." He looked toward the curtained windows, the faintest crease appearing between his brows. "You should let me go." "Go where?" "You can barely stand," Evelyn said, rising and crossing her arms. "And if what you said last night is true, there are hunters outside. You step out that door, and they'll finish whatever they started." His gaze flicked to her, unreadable. "Then I'll take them with me." "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "You should feel nothing for me," he replied quietly. "It's safer that way." Evelyn felt irritation burn through her fear. "Too late for that, I think," she snapped. "I pulled you in out of the storm, remember? You bled all over my floor. I think that entitles me to a few answers." Dorian studied her, his expression unreadable, and then with a sigh that sounded almost human, he unfastened the locket from his neck and set it on the counter between them. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said. "Try me." He hesitated, eyes flicking toward the door, as though listening to something she couldn't hear. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of confession. "The hunters serve the tribunal. They're not human, not entirely, though they like to think so. Their order began centuries ago, born of fear. Fear of my kind." Evelyn froze. "Your kind," she repeated. "You mean, yes," he said before she could finish. "Vampire, leech, monster. Take your pick. We've had centuries of names to choose from." The word hung between them, heavy and unreal. Evelyn had heard the stories whispered by drunk sailors and night shift workers, the shadow people of the old quarters, the pale figures seen at crossroads. But she had never believed them. "You're joking," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "I wish I were." He looked down at his hands, turning them slowly as though he didn't quite recognize them. "The tribunal ruled over us once. Then I defied them, and they marked me for death." "For what crime?" Dorian's gaze lifted, meeting hers with quiet defiance. "Mercy." The word unsettled her more than any threat could have. He leaned back against the counter, exhaustion flickering across his features. "I refused to take blood from a village they ordered purged. They called it compassion. I called it sense. We don't need to slaughter to survive, but the tribunal thrives on fear. Without it, they lose control. So they branded me a traitor and sent their hounds." Evelyn's pulse pounded in her throat. The impossible shape of his story fit too perfectly into the gaps of the world she thought she knew. The unexplained disappearances, the whispers of ritual killings near the river. "And you came here to hide?" "To retrieve something," he said, nodding toward the locket. "That relic belonged to my mother. It was stolen generations ago, sold and resold until it ended up in a place like this." Evelyn frowned, glancing at the ornate piece of silver. "You broke in for that." "It isn't just metal," Dorian said. "It binds the hunger. Without it—" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Without it, the thirst wins." She felt the chill of his words sink into her bones. "So you steal it to control yourself?" "I steal it to stop killing," he said simply. "Does that make me a villain or a savior, I wonder?" Evelyn didn't answer. Her mind was spinning too fast, trying to reconcile the thing sitting on her floor with the bleeding man she'd dragged in from the rain. He looked fragile now, pale and trembling, more victim than predator. But the memory of his crimson eyes lingered, and she couldn't quite decide whether to pity or fear him. The bell above the shop door chimed suddenly. Both of them froze. A shadow passed behind the frosted glass, then another. Dorian's head turned sharply, nostrils flaring like an animal catching scent. "They're here," he said, barely audible. "Stay quiet." Before Evelyn could react, the handle rattled once, twice, then went still. Through the silence came a faint metallic scrape, the unmistakable sound of a lock being tested. Dorian moved with sudden, terrifying grace. One moment he was beside the counter, the next he was across the room, his hand clamping over her mouth as he pulled her behind a tall cabinet. She felt the cold press of his body against hers, the unnatural steadiness of his breath. His eyes, inches from hers, burned with warning. The lock turned. The door creaked open. 3 figures entered, their silhouettes haloed by the weak morning light. The first was tall, wearing a long coat that gleamed wetly from the rain. The second carried what looked like a crossbow made of polished steel. The third whispered something in a language Evelyn didn't know, and the air in the room seemed to darken. She wanted to scream, to demand what they wanted, but Dorian's hand tightened against her lips. "Hunters," he breathed so softly she barely heard it. "If they see you, they'll kill you too." The men moved through the shop with methodical precision, opening drawers, kicking aside boxes, testing shadows with silver-tipped stakes. One of them lifted the broken umbrella she'd dropped by the door. "He was here," the tall one said. His voice was rough but calm, almost reverent. "The scent's fresh." Dorian's eyes closed briefly. Evelyn could feel his pulse, or whatever passed for one, thrumming under his skin. The man with the crossbow aimed toward the back of the store. "Check there." They moved closer. Evelyn's heart pounded so loud she was certain they could hear it. Dorian tensed. Every line of his body coiled like a spring. When the first hunter's shadow fell across their hiding place, Dorian whispered, "Forgive me," and pushed her aside. He stepped into the open in one fluid motion. "Looking for me," he said. His voice no longer human. It carried a resonance that filled the room, deep and melodic, like a chord struck on an unseen instrument. The hunters turned as one. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then chaos erupted. The crossbow fired, the bolt streaking silver through the air. Dorian moved faster than sight. The projectile shattered against his arm with a burst of light, searing flesh that healed before it could fall away. He lunged, not to kill, but to disarm, wrenching the weapon from the hunter's grasp and hurling it across the room. Evelyn watched in frozen disbelief as he fought, not like a beast, but like someone dancing on the edge of despair. He didn't strike to kill, though he easily could have. Every movement was a blur of restraint, every blow aimed to disable. But there were too many of them. One slashed a silver blade across his shoulder, and the hiss that escaped him sounded more pain than rage. Without thinking, Evelyn grabbed the nearest thing, a bronze candlestick, and hurled it at the hunter's head. It struck with a dull thud. The man staggered, just long enough for Dorian to shove him backward into a display case. Glass shattered, and the hunter crumpled. Dorian turned to her, fury blazing in his eyes. "You shouldn't have done that." "You're welcome," she snapped, trembling. The remaining hunter lifted his crossbow again, aiming at Dorian's heart. Without hesitation, Evelyn grabbed the locket from the counter and flung it toward him. "Catch!" He did, instinctively. The moment his fingers closed around the relic, the air shimmered. A pulse of silver light rippled outward, washing over the room like a silent explosion. The hunter's weapon jerked upward, misfired, and embedded itself in the ceiling. When the light faded, all three intruders were unconscious on the floor. Evelyn stared at Dorian, her ears ringing, her body shaking with adrenaline. What the hell was that? He looked down at the locket in his hand, eyes wide with something between awe and fear. "The oath is still alive," he whispered. "After all this time." She didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it made her throat tighten. He met her gaze, and for the first time since the night began, she saw not a thief, not a monster, but a man carrying the unbearable weight of being both. "You've tied yourself to me now," he said quietly. "You don't know it yet, but you have." Outside, the sirens began to wail again, closer this time. The city was waking, and nothing in it would ever be the same. The storm had rolled inland by nightfall, leaving behind streets slick with reflected light and a sky the color of bruised glass. Evelyn had thought foolishly that after surviving the morning's invasion, she would never see Dorian again. But he hadn't left. Instead, he spent the day like a ghost, moving through her shop, silent, restless, his eyes drawn again and again to the window, as if he could already hear the next wave of hunters on the wind. Every few hours she found herself staring too, waiting for shadows to move, for footsteps to echo in the alley. They never did. The world beyond the glass seemed calm, ordinary even, but she felt it in the air, the heaviness of something watching. When she brought him tea, he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by the debris of her father's forgotten artifacts. Chipped chalices, coins blackened by age, fragments of mirrors wrapped in old linen. The locket hung from his hand, gleaming faintly like a captured star. "You should go," she said quietly. "If they're still looking for you, staying here puts both of us in danger." Dorian didn't look up. "You think I don't know that?" His tone wasn't cruel, just tired. "But the relic has bound itself again. Until I understand why, I can't leave." "Bound itself?" Evelyn crossed her arms. "It's a necklace, not a spell." He gave a dry laugh that carried no humor. "Everything forged by blood is both." He turned the locket over in his fingers, showing her the faint etching along its edge, a pattern of thorns encircling a sigil shaped like an eye. "This crest belonged to the House of Verlin, my mother's house. It was said to recognize lineage. When I held it earlier, I felt a resonance, faint but certain, the same resonance it gave off when you touched it." "That's impossible," she said. "I'm human." "So was she," he murmured, almost to himself. "Once." He looked at her. Then, really looked, and the intensity of it made her take a step back. "You said your father collected relics," he went on. "Did he ever speak of where they came from? Who gave them to him?" "Not much," she said after a pause. "He bought them at estate auctions, old monasteries, sometimes from travelers who passed through the port." "Why?" "Because this piece wasn't stolen from a vault," Dorian said. "It was placed here, hidden, perhaps for me to find, or for you." Evelyn laughed softly, though her voice shook. "You think my family's part of some ancient vampire conspiracy?" "I think your blood remembers something your mind doesn't," he said, and the way he spoke it made the hair on her arms rise. He stood and began pacing the narrow room. The movement drew her eyes again to his grace, too fluid, too deliberate. He moved like water flowing around invisible boundaries. "When the Verlin line fell," he continued, "the human houses allied with us were hunted too. Some survived by mingling their blood with mortals, hiding among them until their names faded from record. That locket's reaction means your line was one of them." "That's insane," she said, but she couldn't shake the flicker of memory his words awoke. her grandmother's lullabies, in a language she'd never understood. The family crest carved into her, father's cane, a crescent wrapped in ivy. She had always thought it decorative. Insane, he agreed softly, but true. He stopped pacing, facing her again. You saved me, and now the relic binds you to me. It recognizes you as kin. The words hung between them, heavy and irreversible. Evelyn turned away, staring at the shelves. So what now? Do I start drinking blood too? Not yet, he said dryly, and she almost smiled despite herself. But the hunters will know. They can sense when human blood crosses the veil. You'll glow to them like a beacon. Then teach me how to hide, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Dorian hesitated. You'd rather fight than run? I'd rather survive, she said. And if what you're saying is true, hiding won't save me anymore. He regarded her for a long moment, then nodded once. Very well. But you must understand what that means. The bond between us isn't symbolic, it's literal. If I die, you'll feel it. If you die, I will too. Our fates are intertwined now. Evelyn's breath caught. You're lying. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small space until she could feel the cold emanating from him. I wish I were. The relic doesn't choose lightly. It forges its link through mercy offered freely and blood spilled willingly. You saved me with compassion, and when my blood touched the locket, it answered. It bound itself to the one who showed mercy. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to deny it, but somewhere beneath the fear, she sensed it. The strange pull that had lingered since she touched the locket, the faint echo of another heartbeat beneath her own. So what happens now? She asked softly. You learn, he said. Or you die. He taught her through the night, not in words, but in gestures, movements, and the subtle control of breath. He showed her how to still her pulse until her scent faded, how to walk through moonlight without leaving a trace, how to listen to the air for vibrations too low for human hearing. We survive by silence, he said, by being less than shadow, less than wind. She watched him move, the ease with which he blended into darkness, the sharpness of his perception. He could sense heartbeats through walls, count the steps of rats beneath the floorboards, hear the whisper of waves against the distant harbor. When she faltered, he guided her with cold hands, adjusting her stance with a gentleness that startled her. Don't force it, he murmured. Let the world come to you. At some point, exhaustion blurred the edges of her focus. She leaned against the counter, shivering. Why are you helping me? She asked. If I'm bound to you, wouldn't it be easier to cut the tie, to kill me? His eyes met hers, and for a moment they seemed almost human. Because mercy isn't weakness, he said. You proved that when you saved me. Maybe it's time I learned the same. The admission left a strange ache in her chest. For the first time, she wondered what it cost him to live the way he did. Hunted, hated, mistrusted even by his own kind. She thought of the wound that had sealed overnight, and the haunted look in his eyes when he spoke of mercy. There was a story there, buried beneath centuries of silence, and part of her wanted to know it. As dawn approached, they stood in the half-light, surrounded by relics and the faint scent of dust and rain. The world felt suspended between breaths. Dorian turned toward her, the locket gleaming faintly between them. You should rest, he said. The bond will take strength from you. I'll live, she said. He gave a faint smile. For both our sakes, I hope so. She slept uneasily, dreaming of crimson water and pale hands reaching through it. When she woke, The sun was high, and Dorian was gone. Panic surged until she found the locket resting on the counter beside a single word etched into the dust. Trust. Hours later, as she closed the shop for the evening, the glass rattled violently. She turned, heart hammering, but it wasn't the hunters. Dorian stumbled through the doorway, his clothes torn, his face gray with exhaustion. "They've found me," he gasped. "They've found us." He collapsed before she could reach him, the locket flaring bright enough to burn her eyes. The light pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and in that instant, she knew what he had meant. She could feel his pain as if it were her own. She knelt beside him, clutching his hand, and whispered the only thing that came to her. "Then we fight together." Outside, thunder rolled again over the city, echoing through the empty streets like the sound of something ancient waking from sleep. The city burned quietly that night, the kind of quiet that made the air ache with unspoken fear. Smoke from the harbor drifted inland, carrying the scent of salt and iron. Evelyn followed Dorian through the maze of alleys, their footsteps muffled by rainwater and ash. She hadn't asked how he knew where to go or what waited for them at the end of this labyrinth of shadows. She didn't need to ask. The only thing that mattered was the rhythm of his breathing ahead of her, unsteady, ragged, but determined. The locket pulsed faintly at her throat, a second heartbeat that throbbed whenever she drew too far from him. They were bound. She'd accepted that now. What she didn't understand was the purpose of the bond, the reason an ancient relic would tie a mortal to a creature of the night. They reached a rusted gate hidden behind a crumbling wall. Dorian pressed his palm against the corroded lock, and it opened with a sound, like a sigh. "This place was once a sanctuary," he said, "for both our kinds, long before the tribunal." Evelyn followed him inside. The courtyard beyond was overgrown with ivy, its stones cracked and slick with moss. A cathedral rose from the ruined center, its stained glass windows shattered, its steeple half collapsed. Only the carved sigils above the door remained intact, symbols she recognized from the locket. The crescent and the rose intertwined. "What is this place?" she asked. "The catacombs of Verlin," he replied, "where my mother swore her final oath. If anything can explain why the relic reawakened, it's here." Inside, the air was heavy with age and memory. Candles flickered to life along the walls as they entered, their flames springing up as though stirred by breath rather than fire. Evelyn trailed her fingers over the carved pillars, feeling the grooves of ancient words beneath the dust. The language was unreadable, a flowing script of curves and barbs. Dorian's voice echoed softly. "The script of the old houses. It records the covenants between vampires and humans who once lived as allies. They called them blood oaths, but they were more than that. They were promises to protect each other from extinction." She turned toward him. "You mean, there was peace once?" "For a time," he said. "Before pride corrupted it. The tribunal rose from that corruption, twisting the oath into slavery. They ruled through fear, convincing our kind that compassion was weakness. When I refused to obey, I broke their law. But I also broke something sacred, because I chose to remember." He stopped before a stone altar at the far end of the hall. Upon it lay a sealed book, its cover bound in blackened leather, a silver clasp shaped like a rose. The same sigil as the locket. "My mother wrote this before the fall," he murmured. "She foresaw what the tribunal would become." Evelyn stepped closer. "What does it say?" He hesitated, then opened the clasp. The pages inside were brittle, but the ink glowed faintly as though it had never dried. He read aloud, voice low and reverent. When darkness forgets its mercy, light must remember its shadow. The bond between blood and breath shall not die. The human heart will awaken what immortal pride destroys. He stopped, his hand trembling slightly. She predicted the reawakening of the relic. And it happened because I helped you, Evelyn said slowly, piecing it together. He nodded. Because you showed mercy when none was deserved. The relic recognized that. It chose to bridge what centuries of hatred severed. Evelyn stared at the glowing text, unease curling through her stomach. Then what happens now? What does this mean for us? Dorian looked at her, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Fear. It means the tribunal will come for you, he said quietly. You've become proof that their laws can be broken. They won't allow that to exist. Then we warned someone, she said. There must be others like you. Others who— There are none left, he interrupted. The ones who believed in coexistence were purged centuries ago. We are the last echo of that oath, Evelyn. The weight of his words pressed against her like stone. She turned away, trying to steady her breath. So what? We just hide down here and wait to die? His hand caught her wrist. No. We prepare. He led her deeper into the catacombs. The narrow corridors opened into a vast chamber filled with relics. Swords, chalices, ancient banners, all coated in dust. This was where the oath-bearers gathered before battle, he said. Their blood fueled the wards that protected this city long ago. He ran his fingers over a cracked seal on the floor, whispering something in the old language. The air shimmered briefly, and Evelyn felt the faint hum of power beneath her feet. The wards are still alive, he said. Dormant, but alive. Can they protect us? Only if renewed by both sides of the bond, he replied. That means you and me. She hesitated. You mean I'd have to use your blood? He gave a slow nod. Just a drop. The ritual requires the mingling of mortal breath and immortal essence. It's what the oath was built upon. The idea made her stomach twist, but she didn't flinch. Tell me what to do. He drew a small dagger from his belt, its blade etched with runes that seemed to shimmer in and out of existence. He pressed it to his palm and cut, dark blood welling up immediately. Now you, he said softly. Evelyn swallowed and took the blade. The metal was cold, almost vibrating in her grip. She drew it lightly across her palm, gasping as it stung. Their blood met on the stone, the droplets merging until the seal beneath them flared crimson. A pulse of light rippled through the chamber, followed by a low hum that seemed to echo from the earth itself. The walls glowed faintly, ancient sigils igniting one by one. Dorian closed his eyes, murmuring words that resonated deep in her bones. When the light faded, silence settled once more, but the air felt different, charged, alive. Evelyn looked down at her hand. The wound had already closed, leaving a faint silver scar in the shape of a crescent. It's done, Dorian said. The wards will hold, but only as long as our bond remains unbroken. She flexed her fingers, feeling a strange warmth spreading through her chest. I feel different. You've touched the boundary between life and eternity, he said. Few mortals survive it unchanged. As they turned to leave, faint echoes stirred in the darkness behind them. Footsteps, soft and measured. Dorian froze. We're not alone, he whispered. From the shadows emerged a figure cloaked in black, a symbol of the tribunal etched into the silver mask covering his face. So it's true, the intruder said, voice dripping with contempt. The traitor still breathes, and now he drags a human into his damnation. Dorian's expression hardened. Roan. Evelyn recognized the name, the hunter who had led the attack on her shop. Roan stepped forward, lowering his hood to reveal a face as pale as Dorian's, though his eyes burned with the cold fire of zeal. You should have stayed dead, brother. Evelyn's gaze snapped to Dorian. Brother? Once, Dorian said quietly, before he sold his soul to the tribunal. Roan drew a blade, its edge gleaming like captured lightning. You always did mistake compassion for courage. Now you've infected another with your delusions. Dorian stepped between him and Evelyn, voice low but steady. You don't have to do this. I do, Roan said, because mercy killed our mother, and I will not let it kill our kind. He lunged. The two collided in a blur of movement too fast for Evelyn to follow, shadows twisting around them like living things. Sparks flew as steel met steel, the sound echoing through the chamber. Evelyn backed away, her heart pounding, unsure whether to flee or intervene. The locket at her throat burned hot, pulling her forward as though drawn to the violence. Dorian staggered under a blow, his blade skittering across the floor. Roan raised his sword for the final strike. Without thinking, Evelyn ran forward and grabbed the fallen relic, thrusting it between them. Light exploded from her hands, searing the air with silver fire. Roan screamed, thrown backward into the wall. Dorian caught her before she collapsed, his arms cold but steady. The locket's glow dimmed, leaving the chamber steeped in silence. Roan lay motionless on the floor, smoke rising from his scorched armor. Dorian held her close, his voice trembling against her hair. You shouldn't have done that. I couldn't let him kill you, she whispered. He'll survive, Dorian said grimly. And when he does, he'll bring the tribunal down on us both. He looked toward the shattered entrance, the faint light of dawn creeping in through the cracks. We have until sunset, he said. After that, the hunt begins again. And though Evelyn didn't yet understand what they had unleashed, she knew with absolute certainty that there was no turning back. The next evening bled slowly into existence, the sky a dull bruise pressed against the horizon. A wind from the sea swept through the city, heavy with the scent of rain and the promise of something far more violent. Evelyn stood on the threshold of the cathedral ruins, watching as faint streaks of lightning tore across the clouds. Behind her, the catacombs pulsed with dim light from the wards they had reawakened, each symbol flickering like a heartbeat, fragile and uncertain. Dorian had been silent since their encounter with Roan, his expression unreadable, his movements sharper, more deliberate. He spent hours tracing the cracks along the stone altar, whispering words in a language she couldn't understand, as if trying to piece together a spell too long forgotten. She wanted to ask what haunted him, but she knew better now than to disturb his thoughts when his eyes turned that glassy shade of violet. There was a weight in him, an ache that belonged to centuries rather than years. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was barely above a whisper. He was your brother. Dorian didn't turn. Once. What happened between you? He stood motionless, his fingers tightening around the edge of the altar. He believed in purity. I believed in compassion. The tribunal told him that mercy would be the end of our kind, that to feel anything was to weaken the blood. When I refused to kill, he called it betrayal. He delivered my name to the High Council himself. He turned then, eyes glinting faintly in the candlelight. If he returns with the others, they will not just kill me. They will destroy everything touched by the relic. That means you. Evelyn crossed her arms, trying to hide the tremor in her hands. Then we don't let them find us. He gave a hollow laugh. There is nowhere left to hide. The moment Roan saw you use the relic, the bond's energy marked you. Every hunter in the tribunal can sense it now. You're a beacon to them, Evelyn. She swallowed hard. Then we fight. His gaze softened, almost pitying. You still think this is a battle you can win? I don't think, she said firmly. I know what I've seen. You bleed. You feel. They kill. Maybe that's reason enough to stand with you. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped closer, the air between them electric with something she couldn't name. You remind me of her, he said quietly. My mother. She believed love could bridge eternity. She was wrong, but she died proving it. Evelyn's heart twisted. Maybe she wasn't wrong. Maybe she just didn't live long enough to see it work. He reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself. You don't understand what you're offering. This bond is already taking its toll. Every time I draw strength from it, it drains you. If we fight them, you'll die before the first blade falls. Then stop protecting me, she whispered. Let me protect you for once. Something flickered across his expression. Fear, longing, despair. And then it was gone. He turned away, pulling the hood of his cloak over his head. The wards won't hold forever. When they break, you run. Do you understand me? She didn't answer. The first strike came just before midnight. The air changed, thickened, hummed, and then the earth itself seemed to inhale. The glow of the wards faltered, as if something outside was sucking the magic from the air. Evelyn felt the relic at her throat pulse violently, almost painfully, like a living thing. Dorian spun toward the entrance. They're here. The doors exploded inward with a sound like thunder. Figures poured in, black-clad and silver-eyed, their armor reflecting the candlelight in shards. The hunters moved with inhuman precision, forming a circle around the nave. At their center stood Roan, his face untouched by the battle they'd fought before, his sword gleaming with etched runes that shimmered faintly blue. Brother, he called, his voice echoing through the hall. You can end this. Hand over the relic and the girl. The tribunal may yet show mercy. Dorian stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the cracked stone. Your mercy smells like blood. Better blood than extinction, Roan said coldly. You've forgotten what you are. And you've forgotten what you were, Dorian answered. The air between them crackled, a pressure that made Evelyn's lungs ache. She could feel the bond tightening inside her, a burning thread linking her heartbeat to his. When Dorian moved, she felt it before she saw it, a violent surge of power that pulled at her chest like a tide. He was on Roan in an instant, their blades clashing with a burst of light. The hunters charged, and Evelyn ran, not away, but toward the altar. The relic's pulse grew frantic, its glow spilling across her hands. She remembered the words Dorian had spoken in the ritual, the old language, the invocation of breath and blood, and began to repeat them, her voice trembling. The air shivered, the ward lines along the floor igniting one by one. A hum filled the room, deep and resonant, like 1,000 voices whispering beneath the stone. The hunters faltered as the light grew, but Roan was too fast. He struck Dorian across the chest, driving him back against the altar. Blood splattered across the marble, dark and glistening. Evelyn screamed, the sound raw and ragged. The bond answered her grief. Power flared outward from her body, in a wave that sent several hunters flying. Dorian fell to one knee, his hand clutching the wound, eyes glazed with pain. Evelyn, stop, he gasped. I can't, she said through her tears. I won't let them take you. The air filled with motion, with the sound of metal and fire. The hunters advanced again, blades cutting arcs of silver through the smoke. Evelyn lifted her hands, the relic blazing bright as the sun. Light erupted from her palms, wild and unrestrained, searing through stone and shadow alike. The force threw her backward, slamming her into the altar, but she barely felt it. For a moment she was no longer human. She was the conduit of something ancient, something vast. Roan staggered under the blast, shielding his face. "She's awakening it!" he shouted to his men. "Break the bond!" One of the hunters hurled a blade made of obsidian. It struck the relic, shattering its casing. The silver burst apart, and a blinding flash consumed the room. When the light faded, Evelyn was on the floor, the pieces of the locket scattered around her like fragments of a broken star. The air reeked of burned metal and blood. Dorian crawled toward her, his wounds knitting themselves shut with visible effort. "Evelyn," he whispered, cradling her face. Her eyes fluttered open, the irises no longer brown but molten silver. The bond's energy crackled between them, unstable, violent. "What's happening to me?" she asked, her voice faint. "The relic has chosen," he said. "It's completing the oath." The hunters regrouped, forming a semicircle. Roan raised his sword again, his face twisted with both fury and awe. "You've turned her into a weapon," he spat. "You've damned her, Dorian." "She damned herself by saving me," Dorian said. "That's the difference between us. You see damnation where I see salvation." Roan charged, and this time Dorian met him not as a brother, but as an equal. Their blades clashed again and again, each strike sending ripples of light through the hall. Evelyn struggled to rise, her hands shaking. The fragments of the relic pulsed at her feet, humming softly. Instinct guided her more than thought. She gathered the shards, pressing them against her palm. They melted into her skin, merging with the faint scar left by the ritual. Pain seared up her arm, but when she looked up, the light pouring from her body was steady, controlled. "Dorian," she called, her voice resonating through the chamber. He turned toward her, just as Roan's blade sliced across his side. Evelyn reached out, her hand glowing, and the wound on his body sealed instantly. The bond flared brighter than ever, and Dorian gasped, staggering under the force of it. The hunters hesitated, their weapons trembling as if repelled by an unseen barrier. Roan's eyes widened in horror. "You've bound your souls!" he shouted. "You've made yourselves one!" "Do you know what that means?" "Yes," Dorian said, his voice like thunder. "It means you can't touch her without facing me." He lifted his hand, and the air itself seemed to bend. Shadows coiled around his fingers, merging with the light from Evelyn's palms, until the entire hall glowed in hues of silver and black. Together they moved as one, the mortal and the immortal, two halves of the same will. The hunters broke formation, fear flashing across their faces, but it was too late. A wave of energy surged outward, toppling the statues, shattering the walls, driving their enemies into retreat. When the last of them fled, silence fell again. Smoke curled through the ruins, carrying the scent of blood and rain. Dorian sank to his knees, his strength spent. Evelyn knelt beside him, her heart still racing, her veins burning with power. "It's over," she said, though her voice trembled. He shook his head. "No. The tribunal will not stop. They'll send others, stronger ones. And now that the relic has fused with you, they'll want you more than ever." "Then let them come," she said. "We'll fight together." He smiled faintly, but there was sorrow in his eyes. "You don't understand. The relic's power isn't endless. It feeds on sacrifice. Every time you use it, it takes something from you. A memory, a piece of your soul. And when there's nothing left to give, it will take your life." She stared at him, horror creeping into her chest. "Then we'll find a way to stop it." "There is only one way," he said. "The bond must be broken." Evelyn shook her head violently. "No, I won't lose you. If you don't, you'll lose yourself." Before she could answer, a low rumble shook the ground. The altar split down the middle, the ancient wards flickering like dying embers. The catacombs were collapsing. Dorian pulled her to her feet, dragging her toward the exit. Stones fell around them, dust filling the air. When they reached the outer courtyard, the sky had turned crimson with firelight. The tribunal's banners glowed faintly in the distance, a wall of enemies marching through the rain. Evelyn turned to him, breathless. "We can't fight them all." "No," he said, gripping her shoulders. "But we can give them something to fear." He stepped back, his eyes igniting with a familiar, terrible light. "When I fall, take the relic and run. Don't look back." "Stop talking like that," she said, tears stinging her eyes. "We'll make it together." He smiled sadly. "You already know we won't." The first arrow struck his chest, silver-tipped, burning through his flesh. He didn't flinch. More followed, slicing through the air. Evelyn screamed, rushing to him, but he pushed her aside, raising his hand one final time. Darkness and light exploded from his body in equal measure, colliding in a storm of power that shook the ground and lit the sky. Hunters scattered, blinded by the blast. Evelyn fell to her knees, shielding her face from the radiance that consumed everything. When the world stilled, she crawled toward him through the dust. Dorian lay motionless amid the wreckage, the rain washing blood from his pale skin. The relic's light dimmed at her throat, flickering weakly. She gathered him into her arms, whispering his name. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, the faintest smile ghosting across his lips. "You were right," he murmured. "She wasn't wrong after all." Then his body went still, and the night swallowed his breath. Evelyn clutched him tighter as the wind howled through the ruins, the rain mixing with her tears. The locket's fragments pulsed once more, and then went dark. But beneath her grief, she felt something stir, a warmth deep within her chest, the echo of his heartbeat merging with hers. Somewhere beyond the storm, the tribunal's horn sounded again, announcing the hunt's renewal, but she didn't hear them. She was already becoming something new, something the world was not yet ready to face. The night that followed was one the city would remember for centuries, though no one who survived could agree on how it began. Some said lightning struck the old cathedral ruins, shattering stone and setting the harbor sky ablaze. Others swore that the ground split open and something ancient rose from beneath it. But only Evelyn knew the truth, that it began with silence. The kind of silence that follows a scream too terrible to echo. She knelt beside Dorian's still body, the rain hammering the ruins, washing the blood from his face and from her trembling hands. He looked peaceful now, almost human again, his features soft in the dim light. She whispered his name again and again, as if repetition could summon him back. But there was no breath, no pulse, no answering flicker of those strange violet eyes. The relic at her throat was cold and heavy, its once living light extinguished. She felt hollow, like a glass vessel that had been emptied and left behind. The horns of the tribunal echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. She knew they were coming for her now, drawn to the bond's last spark still clinging to her veins. She should have run, should have hidden, but she couldn't leave him. Her grief rooted her to the ground. The thought that he had died to protect her was unbearable. She had not saved him, she had condemned him. And yet, beneath the noise of the storm, She heard something faint. A heartbeat that was not her own. Slow, heavy, distant, like thunder rolling underground. It came from the relic, a low vibration spreading through her chest. She pressed her hands to the cold metal and whispered, "Please, just once more." For a moment, nothing happened, and then a searing pain lanced through her heart. She gasped, collapsing over his body. The relic flared to life again, not silver now, but blood red, its light pulsing in rhythm with her breath. It felt as though something inside her was breaking open, pouring itself out. She remembered what Dorian had told her. The relic fed on sacrifice, and she understood now what it demanded. "Take it," she whispered. "Take me, if it brings him back." The rain stopped. The air grew still, heavy with the scent of iron and ozone. A soft wind lifted her hair, and the relic's light poured into Dorian's chest. His body convulsed once, then again, as though fighting against the pull of the world itself. His eyes opened slowly, burning crimson before fading to deep violet. He drew a ragged breath, the sound half a gasp, half a cry. Evelyn's relief was immediate and overwhelming, but the triumph died quickly as she felt her strength drain away. Her skin grew cold, her vision blurred. She was giving herself to him. Life for life. "Evelyn!" "Stop," Dorian rasped, his voice barely audible. "You'll die. It's already done," she whispered. "You said mercy was weakness. Prove me wrong." He caught her hand, gripping it so tightly she felt the bones protest. "You foolish, beautiful creature," he murmured, tears mingling with the rain. "You weren't meant to follow me into this darkness." "Too late," she breathed. "It followed me first." He pulled her against him, his mouth at her throat, and she felt the sharp sting of fangs pierce her skin. The world tilted, shadows expanding outward like wings unfurling. Her heartbeat faltered, then steadied again, slower, deeper, resonating in tandem with his. When he lifted his head, his mouth was stained with her blood, and his eyes glowed like twin eclipses. The wound on her neck sealed instantly, leaving only a faint silver mark. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't what she had been either. Something ancient and burning now lived inside her, something neither mortal nor immortal. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the ground. The ruins trembled as the tribunal's soldiers arrived, an army of black armor and silver fire. Their leader rode at the front, face hidden by a helm engraved with the mark of the High Council. Behind him, Roan limped forward, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes fierce. "You've damned yourself," he called to Dorian. "And the girl. There's no place for either of you now." Dorian rose, his movements fluid and inhuman, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said. "We don't belong to this world anymore. We're what comes after it." He lifted his hand, and the air around him rippled. Shadows bled from his fingers, merging with the crimson glow still spilling from Evelyn's heart. The bond between them flared anew, visible now as a luminous thread of light and darkness intertwined, connecting them chest to chest. The tribunal's soldiers raised their weapons, but the sound of steel was drowned out by a roar that seemed to shake the heavens. It came from Dorian, though his lips barely moved, and when he spoke, his voice carried both despair and defiance. "You call yourselves hunters. Tonight, you hunt the end of your own order." Evelyn stood beside him, the relic's light surging through her veins. The power that had once frightened her now felt natural, as if it had always been waiting for her to claim it. She spread her arms, and the rain reversed its fall, rising in a spiral of droplets that shimmered like glass. Each drop froze midair, reflecting the crimson glow that surrounded them. The tribunal advanced anyway, their chants filling the air, their blades humming with enchanted fire. The first wave reached them, and the storm broke. Dorian moved like shadow incarnate, his strikes too fast for the eye to follow, each motion a blur of elegance and violence. Evelyn's power flowed beside his, a counterpoint of light to his darkness. She lifted her hands, and arcs of silver flame burst forth, disarming her enemies before they could touch him. Together, they were a single entity, one breath, one heartbeat, one fury. The ground split under their feet, veins of red light spreading outward like roots through the earth. Roan fought his way through the chaos, his armor scorched, his sword trembling with the effort to resist the growing surge of magic. "Dorian!" he shouted. "You think this is redemption? You've cursed the world to save one girl!" Dorian turned to face him, his expression calm, almost mournful. "No," he said. "I've saved the only part of it worth saving." Their blades met in an explosion of light that tore through the ruins. Evelyn watched them clash, the echo of their battle reverberating through her bones. Roan fought with the desperation of faith betrayed, every strike a plea for meaning. Dorian countered each blow with precision, born of sorrow, his movements less attack than lament. When their swords locked, Dorian whispered something she couldn't hear. Roan's eyes widened, then dimmed as Dorian drove his blade through his heart. The battle ended as suddenly as it began. The remaining hunters faltered, dropping their weapons as the crimson light consumed the field. The tribunal's leader dismounted, raising his hand. "Enough," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of ages. "You've broken every law that binds our kind. You've defied death itself. Tell me, Dorian Verlin, what will you do now?" Dorian looked at Evelyn, his face illuminated by the blood-red dawn that had begun to rise over the city. "We will rebuild," he said softly. "Not as masters or slaves, but as something new." The leader studied him for a long moment, then removed his helm. His face was ancient and weary, his eyes the same strange violet as Dorian's. "Perhaps it's time," he said, lowering his weapon. "Perhaps mercy has earned its place again." He turned to the remaining soldiers. "Leave them. The tribunal's rule ends tonight." One by one, the hunters withdrew, their forms dissolving into mist until only silence remained. The storm subsided, and the first rays of dawn filtered through the shattered roof, illuminating the two figures standing amid the ruins. Dorian turned to Evelyn, his expression softened by exhaustion and awe. "You brought me back," he said, "at the cost of everything." She shook her head weakly. "Not everything. Just the parts that didn't matter." He touched her face, tracing the silver mark at her throat. "You're no longer human. And you're no longer alone," she whispered. The light of morning grew stronger, spilling across his skin. For the first time in centuries, it didn't burn. He looked down at his hands, astonished, as the sunlight wrapped around him like a benediction. The relic's power had rewritten the old law. Night and day, blood and breath, shadow and light, all fused into something that defied both death and divine decree. Evelyn stepped beside him, and together they watched the city awaken below, its spires glinting in the newborn sun. In the silence that followed, he spoke again, his voice quiet but certain. "You've changed everything." "So have you," she said. "Maybe that's what the world needed." He smiled then, a true smile, the kind she'd never seen before, unburdened, unguarded. "Then let's see what it becomes." As the sun rose fully, the last traces of the storm dissolved, and the cathedral ruins glowed with a warmth that felt like the world's first dawn. Somewhere in the distance, Bells began to ring, their sound carrying through the streets like a prayer reborn. Evelyn took his hand, their fingers intertwining, and for the first time since the night she'd found him bleeding in the rain, she felt no fear. The past had burned away, the hunters had vanished, and the bond that had begun with mercy had become something eternal. Together they stood in the light, the last of the old world and the first of the new. Dawn unfolded slowly over the city, pale and deliberate, like a hesitant promise. The storm had passed, leaving the streets glazed with water that mirrored the rising light. Smoke drifted from the ruins of the cathedral, curling into the quiet air like the remnants of a dream. Evelyn stood on the balcony of what had once been the bell tower, her gaze tracing the horizon where the sea bled into the morning sky. Below, the city stirred, a sound of doors opening, of carts rolling, of the living reclaiming what had survived the night. The war between the tribunal and the remnants of the old clans was over, though the echoes of it lingered everywhere, in the broken spires, the charred stones, the ash beneath her feet. But amid the wreckage, something new had taken root. She could feel it in the air, in the rhythm of her pulse, in the strange stillness that hung between each breath. The relic's mark still shimmered faintly at her throat, no longer burning, no longer calling. It rested now like a heartbeat that had finally found peace. Dorian joined her quietly, the sound of his footsteps softer than the wind. He no longer wore the darkness like armor. The sunlight touched his skin without pain, and though his eyes still held the depth of centuries, there was warmth there now, a humanity returned, or perhaps remade. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Words seemed too small for what they had endured. It was enough simply to stand there, side by side, alive when both of them should have been dust. "They're rebuilding in the lower districts," he said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. "The humans, and what's left of my kind. The hunters have disbanded. Some joined them. Some fled." "And the tribunal?" she asked. "Gone," he said. "Their halls are empty. The old laws were burned with their bodies." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Then it's really over." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Nothing ever ends. Not truly. It changes shape. The question is whether we have the courage to shape it into something better." She turned to face him fully. "And do we?" His gaze softened. "You do. You always did." She smiled faintly, though her chest ached with something deeper than exhaustion. "I don't feel like the girl who worked in that shop anymore." "You're not," he said. "She died when you chose compassion over fear. What stands here now is something else entirely." She looked down at her hands, remembering how they had glowed with impossible light, how she had felt power and sorrow fuse into a single pulse that had remade the world. "Am I still human?" she asked. Dorian hesitated, and then he reached for her hand. "You are what humanity was meant to become," he said. "Not less of it, but more. A bridge between what was lost and what might be found again." The words filled her with a strange calm, a sense of belonging she had never known before. The bond between them still thrummed faintly, no longer a chain, but a melody, a quiet song that reminded her they were two notes of the same creation. In him, she saw not a monster, but the reflection of her own defiance, the same fragile hope that love, in its purest form, could rewrite even the oldest of laws. As the sun climbed higher, the city below shimmered with new life. Children ran through the market streets, their laughter rising like birds. The walls that had once separated species now stood as scaffolds for something different: cooperation, maybe even friendship. Where the hunters had once marched, banners of white now fluttered, marked not with symbols of war, but with the simple emblem of a crescent and a rose intertwined. Evelyn had drawn it herself, using the design from the relic's engraving. It had become the sign of the new covenant. The Crimson Accord. Humans and immortals, living not in fear of each other, but under a fragile promise of peace. Dorian watched the people below with quiet wonder. "They will stumble," he said. "They will make mistakes, as all living things do. But maybe now they'll make them together instead of apart." She leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. "You think they'll forgive us?" "They already have," he said. "They're still breathing, aren't they? That's forgiveness enough." They stood there for a long time, letting the wind play with their hair, the sunlight warming faces that had once only known the cold. Yet beneath the peace lay an unspoken truth, that the bond between them, the power that had resurrected him and changed her, could not simply disappear. It slept within them, waiting, not as a curse, but as a safeguard, a reminder of what compassion could do when pushed beyond the limits of reason. Evelyn didn't fear it anymore. She accepted it as part of herself, part of the world that had been reborn through their defiance. When she finally spoke again, her voice was soft, almost wistful. "What happens to us now?" Dorian smiled, the kind of smile that carried both sorrow and hope. "We live," he said simply. "That's more than most are ever given. We live, and we make sure this peace doesn't die with us." The bells of the city began to ring below, clear and solemn, echoing through the valley like a hymn. Evelyn listened, her eyes closing for a moment. "They sound different," she murmured. "They sound free," he said. When she opened her eyes again, the sea glittered beneath the morning light, vast and endless. A flock of white birds rose from the cliffs, wheeling into the sky in perfect silence. She took his hand once more, and they began to descend the worn staircase together, leaving the tower behind. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. As they walked through the courtyard, she glanced at the cracked altar where everything had begun. Wildflowers had already taken root in the crevices, their petals a vivid crimson against the gray stone. Life returning to death, beauty reclaiming ruin. She smiled to herself and whispered, "It was never about the relic, was it?" Dorian shook his head. "No. It was about the heart that dared to use it." By the time they reached the streets, the people had noticed them. A murmur spread through the crowd, a mix of awe, gratitude, and disbelief. No one bowed. No one knelt. For the first time, the old boundaries between light and dark seemed to dissolve, and in their place stood something fragile but real. Understanding. At the edge of the square, Dorian paused, turning toward the horizon. "Do you hear it?" he asked. Evelyn listened. Beyond the hum of the waking city, beyond the crash of the waves, there was another sound. Soft, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the world itself. It pulsed in her veins, resonating with the bond they shared. "Yes," she said. "It sounds alive." He nodded. "Then it's enough." They stood there until the sun crowned the sea, painting the city in gold. For the first time, the light touched them both equally, neither burning nor blinding, but embracing. And as the day unfolded, the past slipped quietly into history, leaving only its lesson behind. That mercy, once deemed weakness, was the power that had remade the world. When they finally walked on, the crowd parted to let them pass. No one spoke. No one needed to. The mark of the relic glimmered faintly on Evelyn's throat, catching the light like a promise, while Dorian's shadow stretched beside hers, indistinguishable in the brightness. Together they disappeared into the morning, leaving behind not heroes, not monsters, but the quiet certainty that the world, at last, belonged to both.